Well, good morning. Thank you once again for joining us on this beautiful Sunday morning video service. Man, Thanksgiving is this week. I hope you're all prepared. I hope everybody has a turkey. I haven't heard of any turkey shortages this year, so that's a good thing. But this fall has been absolutely gorgeous. I have just really appreciated my walks with all the beautiful colors in the leaves. Carl and I have actually gone on drives looking for the locations with the most beautiful colors, and I think Willow Glen probably won out. But there is some beautiful neighborhoods, and I hope you're all enjoying this fall weather too. And right around the corner, Christmas is going to be here before you know it. So we're going to do our Christmas service on December 18th. We're going to have a chili cook-off, so I hope you all come and join us. It's going to be a special time. The worship team is working really hard, putting something together that's special for our family. And then we will still have service on the 25th also, so we'd love to have you come and join us then too. Our men's group is still meeting on Monday nights at 6:30 here at the Father's house and on Zoom. So if you want to be a part of that, let Pastor Carl, Pastor Carlos, or CR know and they'll get you hooked up with that. Our ladies group meets on Thursday nights at 6:30 on Zoom, but this week we will not be meeting just because I'll be too full from eating a beautifully smoked prime rib that my husband's going to put together for me. So we won't be having it this week, but if you want to be a part of it, we'd love to have you join us. The more the merrier at the Father's house. This week is our Missions Sunday, so if you want to give to missions and or your regular tithe and offering, you can go to thefathershouse.org, click on the giving button, set it up as a one-time gift or a recurring gift. Give to our missions that way in Argentina. I know Pastor Juan appreciates every penny. I just wanted to bring something up. If you do give online, a lot of times, well, every time you give online, you should get an email confirming that you made a donation. I had set mine up as a recurring gift and I would get this receipt. And so, okay, I knew I gave. Well, I finally opened one last month and it said that I had been declined because my card had expired. So you might want to open those receipts and make sure it's a receipt and not a declination that you have to go in and update your card information. So I just wanted to bring that up because I missed it for a month and a half. So I had to go back in and reset it up, and it wasn't tough. So if you run into that and you have problems with it, just let me know and I can walk you through the steps to get that done. Also, you can mail a check to the Father's house at 133 Bernal Road, San Jose, California, 95119. Or if you live in the local area and you'd like us to come by and pick up a check or your tithes, we'd be happy to do that. Again, thank you so much for your generosity through this time. I know prices are high on everything. So you have helped keep the Father's house going. I know there's a lot of small churches that are just closing their doors because they can't afford to keep things going. So thank you for your generosity where that is concerned. That's all I have to cover today. So we'll turn the time over to Pastor Carl and see what wisdom he has for us today.
Well, good morning. How is everybody today, Father's House? I bet you guys have been having a good week. You always have a good week, especially when the weather's been the way that it is. And, when we have God in our lives and we have right focus and a right frame of mind and a right state of character or state of mind, then all things are well, even when they're not well. That's not saying that it's not hard going through some things, because it is. But anyway, when you've got your proper focus on God and the things that are important, all of life is a wonderful journey, isn't it? Well, what we're going to say, Penny's talked about Thanksgiving. She talked about Christmas around the corner. We're getting ready for a big Christmas service, which we're going to have a meal out as well. A lot going to be going on these next coming 4, 5, 6 weeks as we kind of head towards the end of the year and into next year. So there's a lot to look at. There's a lot to think about. Man, I hope you've got a lot of money to buy presents for everybody, because it's going to be tough this year with this economy. It doesn't matter what you go to buy; everything's just tripled in price. You just look at it, you go, "You've got to be kidding me! I'm not buying that." And he said, "They want it more." I would say they want it more than I do. So anyway, I feel your pain and your frustration, but I know this, that we'll all get through it and we'll all be just fine. With that said, What do we want to talk about today? Do you want to talk a little bit more about the book of James? I guess that's kind of what we're supposed to be doing. And I hope you've enjoyed this. This has been, I was thinking about this, and I've kind of said this is very difficult to teach the book of James because it's so fragmented, and just the way that it's written, it's not fluid. It just doesn't flow well. With that said, though, I've enjoyed it because it's really made me think and think on a deeper level. And I was just talking with Penny this morning. I was saying, man, because there's so many different things I have to study for. I said, I've got to study for all this other stuff. And then I don't get to study the stuff I want to study because I'm forced to study other stuff. Not that I'm complaining because, and I kind of take my hats off to Penny because she takes on such a load around here at the Father's house that she gives me the opportunity and she gives me the grace and the time to do proper studying in the areas that I love to study and those areas that I need to study. And some areas you need to study, other areas you love to study. And so for me, whenever we're talking about wisdom and how profound wisdom is, I always love that study. And so out of the book of James, and this is the counterpart to Proverbs, it's a book of wisdom. And that's why it's hard to understand, why it's choppy, because it's broken up into little fragments and little statements that James wants to infer certain truths concerning. So we're going to talk about some of those today and see if we can't make heads or tails and just find ways for them to add to our life. And so James here in these texts, he's just not making theological statements. He's making philosophical statements, and I'm not going to touch on those for the most part because I think I'll let them lie. But these parts in here are just they're steeped with early ancient philosophers, mainly pre-Socratics, even to some extent. They're almost Homeric in nature, or Sophocles, really. But we're not going to get into that. But that's something that I love. So that's why I had to mention it. So we're going to go into James chapter 3, and we're going to pick up in verse 1 and read some things that pertain to me and pertain to you. Well, I guess they pertain to all people, but me primarily, even too, as being a teacher. It says, let not many of you become teachers, my brethren, knowing that as such we will incur a stricter judgment. Notice what he did there. Let not many of you become teachers, my brethren, knowing that as such so he makes himself out to be a teacher of wisdom, right? We will incur a stricter judgment. The teacher is going to incur a stricter judgment. For we all stumble in many ways, and if anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body as well. Now, if we put the bits into the horse's mouth so that they will obey us, we direct the entire body as well. Look at the ships also. Though they are so great and are driven by such strong winds, are still directed by a very small rudder, wherever the inclination of the pilot desires. So also the tongue is a small part of the body, and yet it boasts of great things. See how great a forest is set aflame by such a small fire. And the tongue is a fire, the very world of iniquity. The tongue is set amongst our members as that which defiles the entire body and sets on fire the course of our life, and is set on fire by hell. Pretty choppy, isn't it? For every species of beasts and birds, of reptiles and creatures of the sea, is tamed and has been tamed by the human race. But no one can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil and full of deadly poison. With it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the image and likeness of God. From the same mouth come both blessings and cursings. My brethren, these things ought not to be this way. Does a fountain send out from the same opening both fresh and bitter water? Can a fig tree, my brethren, produce olives, and a vine produce figs? Nor can salt water produce fresh. So you can see in this first part of this chapter, you can kind of just see how broken up it is, and like how it just doesn't read well. It's just like when you read it, it's just almost incoherent. So you've kind of got to go back and you've got to ask yourself the question, what is it that James is saying here? And I think these texts that I just read, we've got to break apart into smaller bite-sized pieces so that we can make some kind of sense out of what's being said here. So I want to talk about the first 4 verses, and what we get through today, we get through today. And if we don't get through them all, it doesn't matter. We can pick it up again next week. But the first 4 verses of this, which I read, it says, "Let not many of you become teachers, my brethren, knowing that as such we will incur a stricter judgment." Teachers are going to incur a stricter judgment. "For we all stumble in many ways, and if anyone does not stumble, he is a perfect man or a mature man, and he's able to bridle his whole body as well. Now, if we put the bits into the horse's mouth so that they will obey us, we direct the entire body as well. Look at the ships also. Though they are great and are driven by strong winds, are still directed by a very small rudder, wherever the inclination of the pilot desires." So what is it that James is saying here? And let's see if we can break it down. Because it has to do with the idea and the notion of a teacher. And it has also to do, what he's saying here, is what a teacher teaches. And this becomes very important. The teacher and what the teacher teaches. So the first thing he says is, let not many of you become teachers. Because when you become a teacher, like me, James is saying, you will incur a stricter judgment. In other words, you're going to be held to a different standard, a stricter standard than people that are being taught. And so what he's saying is, and it's the idea, and what he's trying to convey here is the idea of there's this notion of what I would call a teacher qua teacher, or a teacher for the sake of teaching, or a teacher for the sake of teacher. And what he's saying here is, but then there's those teachers that want to teach because they like the position of honor. They like the position of prestige, and they like the idea of being a person that is empowered above other people. It's almost like this hierarchy. They're greater than. And what the apostle is saying here is that that's the wrong motivation for you to become a teacher. You don't become a teacher so that you can basically have this position of honor. And the reason that he's saying that is because during this time in James's life and in the religious life of the Jews at that time, to be a teacher would have been one of the highest honors that could be bestowed upon men. But men took that honor unto themselves rather than having that honor either bestowed on them by God or by them being in and of themselves naturally predisposed to teaching and being a teacher. Let me give an example. There are some people that just say, I've got to teach, I want to preach, or whatever the case might be. But when you ask the motive, or you look for the motive of why they want to do it, it's not because they want to convey information, but it's because they like the popularity. They want their voice to be heard. And so it's almost the idea of what James is saying here is he's saying, if you're going to be a teacher, remember this, keep your teaching in the right perspective because you're going to be held to a higher standard. And if you're doing it for fame, if you're doing it for honor, if you're doing it for prestige, or so that you can lord it over other people, I want you to know that your judgment will be imminent. It's going to come. And he's saying this not just about people that are not Christians, like somehow Christians are not going to be judged in different ways. And I know that judgment seems to be a harsh word here, and it is, but it's the idea that James wants to make sure that those people that teach are held accountable for what it is that they teach. Now he's going to go on, he's going to describe exactly what it is that a teacher ought to be teaching. So that this becomes very important. So this is what he said. He says, now, all of us sin in many ways. None of us are perfect. We all have faults. We all fall short in many, many ways. And if we didn't fall short, then we would be a perfect man or a completely mature individual, is what he's saying. So it's this idea of going on to maturity. And so the more that we mature and the more we go on into maturity, the less out of control we are in our lives. And so he goes on and say this, and he's now going to be talking about what the teacher teaches is he teaches us how to be in control of our lives, both internally and externally. In other words, those things that are the passions that are in us, the desires that are in us, and the emotions that are in us that can drive us the wrong way, and also external forces that can mislead us and draw us in the wrong direction. So he does this by using two different metaphors here, right? The first one has to do with a bit in the mouth. So it says in verse 2 again, for we stumble in many ways. If anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man and able to bridle the whole body as well. Now, and this is the first part of it. Now, if we put the bits into the horse's mouth so that they will obey us, we direct their entire body as well. So what he's talking about, and I'm sure that most of us realize and understand this, is that when you put a bit into the mouth of a horse, you control the horse because you control the neck. Let me give an example of that. As many of you know, that I did Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for many, many years. And as you mature in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you begin to realize that there's certain leverage points that you can use to your advantage on a person's body when you're grappling, wrestling. One of those is actually the head. So you can work a cross face where you basically come across the guy's face, and so if a cross face, if I was going to take and turn the head, the body automatically has to follow wherever the turning of the head goes. If you turn it the other way, the body automatically has to turn. Otherwise, what's going to happen? Well, you're going to break your neck. So what he's saying here is he's saying that in the same way that happens, like in grappling, or if you take this horse, this beautiful animal that's full of strength and muscle, and if any of you have ever ridden a horse or been up close with horses, you understand how powerful a horse is. What he says is that by putting the bit in the mouth, you can control the strength of the passions of that animal. And so he's saying the teacher's job is to do the exact same thing in people that are not mature. It's to put a bit in their mouth to be able to restrain their passions, their desires, their emotions to some extent. So in the other way, thinking about it in this way, the passions that we're talking about, when we're not mature, is we run rampant with them. Let's think about a child. When we're raising up a child, when a child is, let's say, 3 years old, and they want something, let's say that it's before dinner, and they see a bowl of candy up on the counter, and they look up at that and they say, I want that candy. And so they get up, climb up on the counter, and they go get the candy, and the mother says, no, you can't have that candy. We're getting ready to eat dinner, and because of that, you can't have any candy. And the 3-year-old begins to yell and scream and cry and say, I want that candy. And they begin to climb up on the counter to grab the candy. And the mother simply says, you cannot have that candy. And the reason isn't because you've got to have dinner. So she takes the candy and she puts it up on top of the refrigerator, and the child throws a temper tantrum because he wants the candy. In that case, his passions are so overrun with his desire for this candy that he wants, that he can't understand that he can't have it because he's not in control of himself. And there's this part where this young kid, boy or girl, has to learn control or learn self-control, but that self-control is only learned as the mother or the father teaches the young child. So what James is saying here is the job of the teacher is to put the bit in the mouth of a person so that he can begin to teach that person self-control over all of their desires. It can be our desires for fame. It can be our desires for wealth. It can be our desires for strength, our desires for food, for alcohol, addictive behaviors, for sexual encounters outside the bonds of marriage. It can be all of these different things that are destructive to a person. Well, the teacher's job is to teach those things and to put the bit of the virtues in their mouth so that they learn how to conduct themselves. So what he's saying is the teacher's job is to teach us how to control ourselves, to be in control of our life. It really is kind of the culmination of what we've been talking about for this last year when we talk about the virtues, about the virtue of temperance, which is self-control, controlling your own spirit, the virtue of courage, which is strength of mind, controlling the thoughts of your mind when you face hard and difficult encounters. It's about the idea of justice, of being and giving other people their just due or what is their right due. And all of that is done through rational reasoning so that we reason about these things well. So what the teacher's job is to teach you how to control your appetites, to control your desires so that you live a better life. The second thing, though, that's that internal part I talked about. The second part, though, is this idea of the external that the teacher is supposed to teach. So he says here in verse 4, he says, look at the ship also, though they are great, big ship, and they are driven by strong winds, are still directed by a very small rudder, wherever the inclination of the pilot desires. So the teacher's job isn't just to teach us how to control ourselves, because you see, when we know how to control ourselves, we no longer need a teacher. We no longer need a tutor. Let me give an example of that. If you were a tradesman, let's say you wanted to be a master carpenter, well, you would come under the tutorship or the apprenticeship of maybe a master carpenter or a bunch of master carpenters that would teach you the profession. But once you learned that profession and you became a master carpenter, you would no longer need a teacher because you had the skill of being a master carpenter. Now, it doesn't mean you couldn't learn from others, but you wouldn't need them to produce or to perfect your craft. In the same way, the teacher's job is to teach you how to become self-governing, self-teaching, to enable yourself to learn and to empower yourself how to live a good life and a Christian life. So the first one we dealt with was this internal mechanism, which has to do with our desires and our passions, our emotions, our thoughts, which really are self-control, aren't they? And strength of mind that we've been talking about. But we're also talking then about reasoning well, practical reasoning or prudence, when we talk about those external forces that come our way, or the strong winds. So in this metaphor, he's talking about us as people, and the job as a teacher is dealing with people when external forces want to seek to drive you in a direction you don't want to go. So in that case, we think about a sail ship, don't we? Or a sailboat or a sail ship that's got these sails, and when this wind is coming a certain direction, that wind is going to take that boat whichever way that wind wants to, unless it's got the power of this small rudder in the back, which can steer the boat even in the wind. So even though the boat wants to go one direction, the rudder, by trimming the sails correctly, and by using the rudder, can use these other forces to its advantage to move forward in the direction that it wants to go. Now, this becomes important. It becomes important because the forces that James is talking about here is not always a good wind that's leading us in the right direction, because we can steer easily that direction. But when there's a contrary wind, when there's a wind blowing that is contrary to what is best in your life. It's the winds of friends when the friends want to take you in the wrong direction. It's the winds of circumstances that causes you to despair or to live in fear. And so what he's saying is the job of the teacher is not just to teach somebody how to deal with the internal passions and desires that they have, but also those external forces, which can be bad friends, bad influences, things that happen by chance that that there's nothing you can do to foresee or to change. So the idea of what the teacher's job is, according to James in this text, is to help you how to learn your life with these internal things that we all deal with, our will, our desires, our wants, our needs, and to deal with these exterior things that can divert us off the good path, or the Christian path, or the path of wisdom for our life. So that's that first proverb that he's really talking about here. The job of the teacher and what the teacher ought to teach. But at the end of the day, it's all geared toward the fact that we might become, as he would say, perfect men and women. That word meaning mature men and women. Again, like I said, when a craftsman becomes mature in his craft, he's mature in his craft. In the same way, a Christian, when they're mature in their Christian faith, in their Christian conduct, their Christian moral character, they no longer need a teacher because they become a craftsman of their own life. That's kind of what James is saying here. Now James is going to take another thought. He's going to take a divergence here. He's going to talk about our tongue and boastful people. And so this is probably the only other one that I think we'll get through for the sake of time today. But let's see if I can get through it. He says in verse 5 then concerning boasting, so also the tongue is a small part of the body, and yet it boasts of great things. See how great a forest is set aflame by such a small fire. And the tongue is a fire, the very world of iniquity. And the tongue is set amongst our members as that which defiles the entire body and sets on fire the course of our life and is set on fire by hell. What in the world is he talking about? So he's talking about this idea and this notion of the tongue. And so what he's talking about is by way of our speech. And I guess there's this idea and this notion of that we give honor to who honor is due. In other words, when we see a judge, because of a judge's position and because of a judge's integrity, there's a certain amount of honor that we give to him. The same way we should with a police officer because of what they do, what their role is in our society as far as their police power goes. Now, I know that a lot of them come across, and they shouldn't, the way that they come across as arrogant, that it's sometimes hard to give them their honor, but it's something that we ought to do. But I understand that sometimes it can be difficult to do. But there's this idea, this notion that there's certain there are people that come and that they have an honor due to them because of the body of work that they do. A judge would be that person. We would actually say the same thing about a doctor. We give honor to a doctor, and we do that because a doctor has that right because they've been studious enough and practiced enough to where we give our lives into their hands to make us whole or healthy. We would maybe do the same thing with a political figure, which we would do with one that we respected or whatever the case might be, and also with a pastor or with a teacher, so to speak, or a professor. So we give them honor and the honor that would be due them. But what he's saying here is that, but where we get into a problem is we get into a problem with ourselves when we think about ourselves higher than we ought to think. In other words, there's this proper self-image that God wants us to have. That's why Jesus says that we're to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. So there's this idea of a self-love, of wishing and wanting the best for ourselves. And so with that, then, there's this position, or there's an honor amongst all men and amongst all women, all people, and there's an honor that is due them because of the body of work of what they've done. You honor a carpenter because they're a great craftsman. You would honor, I don't know, whatever the case, an artist because they're great at their art of what they do, or of whatever the case might be, saddle making, whatever the case might be. You honor them because they've got this craft, they've got this talent that they've perfected. But he's saying here, but what happens sometimes is that we begin to boast and we begin to elevate ourselves above other in our boasting about who we are and what we do. It's saying it's kind of like, and what it really has to do with when we're talking about tongue and boasting, it's about the idea, and I think that all of us understand this, is when somebody is a one-upper of something that you've done or something that you've said or something that you've achieved. So let's say that maybe you tell a story about, gosh, you know what? I just had this instance where, I was able to help this person and this is how I was able to help them. And you were telling a story. And they come up and they say, oh, you think that's nothing. I did that to 5 people last week and 10 the week before that. And so there's almost this idea of boasting, of putting themselves above other people by the use of their tongue. And what James is saying is that when you begin to do this, you kindle a fire. You kindle a fire in yourself because you elevate yourself above what should be given your honor. And when you do that, there's something base about that. There's something vulgar about that because you're proclaiming something other than what you are. You're boasting about yourself. You're making you the center of attention here. He says this isn't good. When you do that, you're putting yourself on fire. Your tongue becomes this fire where you diminish the value of the other person's actions or who they are. And so your boasting isn't good. In other words, your boasting destroys both you and the other person by your insensitive nature towards the situation. In other words, boasting isn't a part of the Christian life. Speaking the truth is. Understanding the value and the honor that should be given to you is a big part of loving yourself. But the idea is, what he's saying here is, but to promote yourself above others, to look for that position of power above them, is not good. Matter of fact, he says that when we do that with our tongue and we boast with our tongue, the very origins of that boast is that which is found in hell. What does he mean by that? He's basically saying That comes, and its source is from Satan or the deceiver himself. That when we allow ourselves to boast, what we ultimately are doing is we're basically deceiving ourselves and we're trying to deceive others. It's the exact same thing that the serpent did to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. It was his boastful arrogance that led them astray, to looking in for them, to taking a position above and beyond that which God wanted them to have. So what's James saying in these two texts? He's saying two different things, isn't he? He's saying, number one, let not many of you become teachers, because in so doing, you're going to incur stricter judgment. If you're going to teach, teach for the sake of teaching. Don't teach for the sake of honor, prestige, power, fame, to lord it over another person. And understand that your job as teaching is with the goal of making people perfect or making people mature. We do that by use of the virtues of faith, hope, and love, the cardinal virtues of prudence, of justice, of courage, temperance. Others we've talked about in this last year, we've talked about the virtue of friendship, the virtue of religion, and other virtues as well. And by that, we learn to control our passions, our will, and we begin to use prudence or practical reasoning on how we ought to live our life and how our life should be lived. So he's talking about the teacher. But the teacher's view, and then the external forces when they come, is to teach a person how to navigate through life using the virtues. The end goal of all of our teaching is so that people become autonomous moral creatures, or moral men and women of God, who know how to govern themselves well. That they completed the apprenticeship and they now stand as a craftsman of their own life. The second thing, which is completely separate from this, is he says that boasting is not good. That the man who is prudent, the man who is truly wise, the woman who is wise, will refrain from boasting and have a proper view of themselves. Anything less than that destroys you and destroys the other people that you encounter. Well, they don't tie together very well, do they? But they're written in the same chapter. But I think that from both of those, there's many, many lessons that we can learn. I hope that you'll put these two lessons to heart, that you'll think about them deeply. And in thinking about these things, that you might think how you might change your life. But more importantly than that is that you might look at these and say, how do I perfect myself? How do I make myself more mature? How do I make myself the craftsman of my own life? Or where I become morally autonomous and morally good. We do that with the help of God. But remember this, you don't become a craftsman without putting in the work. I hope you'll take these things to heart. I hope you'll say yes to the wisdom of God and participate in what it is James is asking us to do. It's not in a negative sense he's saying. He's saying this is a proverb of things to think about, things that we can grow from. And I hope you'll do that, as I will and promise to do it as well. Well, God bless you. Have a great day, and I'll see you again.